Hello, everybody. Welcome back to your Curiosity. Today is a special day for the channel for two reasons. The first reason, and the small reason you can say, is that our channel has crossed 1,000 subscribers after 7 years. So that's a big achievement in my view. So that's the first reason, and the second reason is the more special reason. What better way to start a new video after 1,000 subscribers than a debate between two prolific philosophers talking about metaethics and discussing whether morality is objective or not. So the debate is going to be morality is objective. So Mike Huemer, we have with us Mike Huemer. He's going to be for the proposition that morality is objective. He's claiming that moral facts exist. And we have Lance Bush, who is a moral anti-realist, who claims that morality is relative and not objective. So yeah, let's start the debate. Talking about my channel, if you're discovering me for the first time, after hearing about this debate in Discord servers and all other places, my channel's name is Curiosity. As you can see, my name is Abhishek. I discuss philosophy and science. I started off with science, and these days I'm discussing philosophy. Mostly it's free will and metaethics that I'm interested in these days. So I have made a lot of videos on free will, a lot of arguments against free will. I think Mike is gonna raise a few eyebrows there, but yeah, we can have a conversation about that later. So, and Lance is with me on free will as well as metaethics. We both are anti-realists about metaethics, and we don't believe in libertarian free will either. But yeah, for today's debate, I'm the mediator, so I'll have to be unbiased as the Statue of Liberty, you can say. So yeah, that's going to be my aim, and I hope I fulfill my duties and responsibilities here. All right, so let me introduce you the interlocutors for the debate. Lance Bush is a psychologist and philosopher who works in moral psychology and metaethics. He's a moral anti-realist, and he's a foodie for you guys who are foodie out there to relate with him, maybe. And talking about Mike Huemer received his BA from UC Berkeley and his PhD from Rutgers University. He is presently professor of philosophy at the University of Colorado at Boulder. He's the author of more than 80 academic articles in ethics, epistemology, political philosophy, and metaphysics, as well as about 12 brilliant and amazing books that you should all read and buy, including the problem of political authority, dialogues of ethical vegetarianism, ethical intuitionism, knowledge, reality, and value. So yeah, we have both our interlocutors here. I have to say that I'm very, very, very excited for this debate. I've been waiting for this for quite long. I've talked to Lance for a few months ago, talking about wanting to debate Mike, and the day has finally arrived. And I'm very happy and very excited, and I hope it goes well. I hope we all have a good faith, respectable discussion about metaethics. So yeah, let's start with it. So yeah, we're gonna start with Mike. Mike is gonna make his case for moral realism with his opening statement. So yeah, the mic is yours, Mike.
Okay, thanks, curiosity guy. Okay, so I guess I'm going to sort of summarize what I said in my book. So my book, Ethical Intuitionism, that everyone should buy. All right, so are there objective moral facts? That's our question. And first, I'll say something about what that means. What does it mean that there are objective moral facts? Objective means something like independent of the attitudes of observers towards the objects of evaluation. Okay, so if something is objectively good, that means it's good, and whether it's good doesn't depend upon how people feel about it or what people believe about it or something like that. Okay, so I think there are objective moral facts. So what are the alternatives? Okay, so if there aren't any objective moral facts, then it could be that all moral statements are false. Or if they're true, it could be that their truth depends upon the attitudes of observers towards the things being evaluated, or it could be that they're neither true nor false. And so I just want to say, I don't think any of those things are the case. All right, so if none of those is the case, then there are moral truths and they don't depend upon observers, so there are objective moral truths. Okay, so, all right, so why do I think that they're not all false? Well, for example, I think you shouldn't torture babies for fun. If you have a baby, you shouldn't torture it just for the fun of it, right? And, that's partly because I think pain is bad. I think you shouldn't cause bad things for trivial reasons. Okay, but, just the fact that you shouldn't torture children for the fun of it, it's just about the most obvious premise that you could find in a philosophical argument. And, in the history of philosophy, philosophers have put forward a lot of theories and a lot of premises to argue for their theories. And it's pretty hard to find a premise that's more obvious or less controversial than that one. Okay, so it seems like that should be fair. That should be a fair starting point. Don't torture children for fun. Okay, so that's not false. All right, so we should reject, the first alternative that all moral statements are false. Okay, second alternative, maybe the moral statements, maybe sometimes they're true, but their truth depends on the attitudes of observers. Well, no, that just doesn't seem to be true. So if you like torturing babies for fun, then is it okay to do it? No, it seems like it's obviously still wrong. What if you have a sentiment of moral approval towards baby torture? Then should you do it? No, you still shouldn't do it. It still seems like it's wrong. What if you believe that it's okay to torture children for fun? Right? Then is it okay to do it? No, still seems like you shouldn't do it. Okay, what if your society approves of it? What if there are different conventions and there's a society in which the convention is, you torture babies for fun? No, still seems wrong and bad. Okay, so it seems like it doesn't depend on the attitudes of observers towards the thing being evaluated. In this case, the object of evaluation is baby torture. Okay, so moral statements, they're not all false, and they don't depend on the attitudes of observers. The other alternative is maybe they're neither true nor false. This is referred to as non-cognitivism. So the non-cognitivists think they're neither true nor false because they don't really assert propositions. Meaning, when you say that something is wrong, you're not actually describing any alleged state of affairs. You're not even asserting that the world is any particular way. And you're doing some other kind of speech act, like you're expressing your feelings or you're trying to influence other people's behavior, but you're not trying to describe any fact about the world or about yourself or about anything. Okay. So, all right, and so then that would make them neither true nor false. So then, torture is wrong is something like boo on torture. Okay. So boo on torture is just an expression of your negative feelings about it. It's not either true or false. Okay. So the main problem with this is known as the Frege-Geach problem. So this theory could explain what it means when you just make a straight out ordinary moral assertion. When you say X is wrong, they can explain that means you're expressing a negative emotion about X, right? Or you're trying to influence other people to not do X or something like that. But they can't explain what it means when X is wrong appears in a larger sentence. It appears embedded in a larger sentence where it's not actually being asserted. All right, so if I say, if doing something is wrong, then getting your little brother to do it is also wrong. Okay, which seems like a correct judgment. What could they say that means? So if the word wrong is used to express a negative emotion, what am I expressing a negative emotion towards when I say that? If doing something is wrong, am I expressing a negative emotion towards doing something? No, right? I haven't even said what it is that might be wrong, and I didn't even assert that anything was wrong. I just said if doing something was wrong. If there was something that doing it was wrong, then you also shouldn't get your little brother to do it. So I haven't expressed a negative feeling towards anything, right? And you couldn't have a negative emotion towards just doing something in general. All right, so they have a hard time explaining that, and it's not just that particular sentence. It's any sentence in the English language that enables you to embed an assertion in a larger context. So there are many different constructions where you take a proposition, then you say something else involving that proposition as a smaller part of it. Okay, so it's true that P, like that's a normal construction in English where you have to put a proposition in for P. Or I wonder whether P, and then you have to put a proposition in for P. Okay, so any context in English where you have to insert a proposition, it's okay to put a moral statement. And it's not okay to put things like hooray for the Broncos. Right? It's not okay to put the standard uncontroversial examples of non-assertive speech acts, but it is okay to put moral statements in there. Right? So the non-cognitivists have to explain why it just looks exactly like these are propositions and like any test that you come up with in the language. Okay, so what does it mean to wonder whether P, where P isn't a proposition? So you can wonder whether abortion is wrong. Like that makes sense. Okay, so it looks like moral statements assert propositions, so they're the kind of thing that should be either true or false. It's not plausible to say that they're always false, and it's not plausible to say that their truth value depends upon our attitudes. It doesn't depend upon the attitudes of the either the speaker personally or the speaker's society in general or people in general. So it looks like there are moral statements that are true independent of the attitudes of observers, so there are objective moral facts. Okay. And I don't really know. I don't know why this is not. This is frequently rejected, right, by the other two people here, but also by many other philosophers, and also people who are not philosophers, but just like scientists or other intellectuals. It's very frequent to reject moral facts, and many people, I think, consider it incredible. Right? I guess they find it counterintuitive, right? I find it counterintuitive that there aren't moral facts, but some people find it counterintuitive that there are. And I don't know what's going on. Right? But anyway, I guess, I just make some, programmatic last remarks. Skepticism is very common in philosophy. When people start thinking about philosophy, professional philosophers and also just like non-professional philosophers just start thinking about philosophy. It's very common for them to reach some incredibly skeptical conclusion. Oh, sorry, my screen is going blank for a second there. Okay, it's very common for them to reach some incredibly skeptical, highly revisionary conclusions. And so I think there's just something that goes wrong. There's something that very commonly goes wrong in the human mind, like when you start thinking about philosophy, that you just sort of like forget the most obvious truth. It seems like it's okay to just start saying things that are radically revisionary and absurd on their face, which you wouldn't consider doing if you were in any other field. Like if you're in geology, one of the major theories in geology wouldn't be the Earth doesn't exist, rocks don't exist, there's nothing. Like our entire subject matter doesn't exist. Or if you're in biology, one of the major theories would not be nothing is alive, there are no living things, right? And if we had to debate things like that, like they would have a hard time making progress. If there were a bunch of philosophers, doing biology, we wouldn't have much progress in biology because they would refuse to admit that life existed. Right. But in philosophy, like whatever the field is, there's always like one of the major things you have to talk about is whether the whole subject exists. Like you're doing epistemology. Now you have to talk to skeptics about whether anybody knows anything, right? Trying to figure out the nature of knowledge and how we know the things we know. But somebody said, no, nobody knows anything. And this is relevant to bring up because if it was just one common sense thing that philosophers were denying, then it might be plausible to think, oh, okay, so maybe we got that wrong. But like everything that the philosophers talk about, they start saying, oh, maybe that doesn't exist at all. Right? You're doing aesthetics, like what makes good art and what makes bad art. Some people will say, oh, there's no such thing as good art, right? Or, you're talking about free will, like, hey, what makes people responsible for their actions or something. There's going to be a bunch of people saying, oh, nobody's ever responsible for anything, right? You're talking about the nature of the mind. There's going to be some people who say, oh, no, there's no such thing as the mind. We're all just mindless automatons, stuff like that. Okay, so then, like when there's, so many common sense things that the philosophers are denying, I think the reasonable thing to think is, there's something wrong with philosophers. And when you start feeling radically skeptical, it's probably a bias that occurs when you start doing philosophy, right? Rather than that, there are all of these seemingly obvious things don't really exist. Okay, that's all.
Thank you so much, Mike, for your opening statement. That was kind of precise. You took 10 to 11 minutes for that. So there was a lot there. So I'll switch over the mic to Lance. Lance, you can go ahead with your opening statement.
Yeah, I would like to start with that last thing that Mike Huemer said about these like revisionary views that are absurd on their face, these radically skeptical views. I just completely and outright deny that moral anti-realism is in any sense revisionary or radically skeptical. And part of the reason I deny this is because I deny that moral realism is a common sense position. In order for moral realism to be a allegedly common sense position, it would presumably need to be a position that is widely held among non-philosophers. However, I take the question of whether moral realism is widely held among non-philosophers, or at least whether people have realist intuitions or speak or act in ways that reveal some sort of implicit commitment to realism, to be an empirical question. And that's what I do research on. So my area of specialization is the psychology of metaethics. And what I worked on in my dissertation was the question of, are most people without formal training in philosophy, moral realists? And the conclusion I came to was probably not. That does not mean that I think most of them are anti-realists. What I endorse is a position called folk metaethical indeterminacy. I don't think non-philosophers have realist or anti-realist intuitions prior to exposure to philosophy, nor do I think they speak or act in ways that determinately fit with a realist analysis of how they speak or think or act. And rather, I think that there's no need to attribute any presupposition of realism or anti-realism to how they think or how they speak at all. One analogy that Michael Gill gives in the paper Indeterminacy and Variability in Metaethics is that when we look at people commonly making use of numeric talk, mathematical talk, there's no particular reason to project or impose on them the necessity for them to endorse Platonism or anti-Platonism about mathematics. And I think very much the same thing about ordinary moral discourse, that we don't require any particular commitment to realism or anti-realism. So there's a few more things I could say about this. One is that empirical research on how non-philosophers think about the question of realism or anti-realism is in its early days. Perhaps the most seminal work was a paper by Goodwin and Darley from 2008, so not that long ago, less than 20 years ago. There were earlier papers, 2003 or so. There's a Nichols and Foltz-Bennett that looked at this, whether children are realists or anti-realists. Now that research, a lot of the focus of my own dissertation was on the methodological problems in the early research. Now I should say the early research did find a lot of conflicting judgments among non-philosophers. If you gave them questions that were intended to elicit their attitudes about realism and anti-realism, their judgments about whether a particular case was indicative of whether the case that they were presented with prompted them to give a realist or an anti-realist response, they give variable responses. However, Thomas Polzler, Jennifer Wright, and quite a few other people, James Beebe, started to note that there were empirical issues with this research, and subsequent more rigorous methods have started to sort of peel back some of the methodological problems with those early studies. And this culminated in a paper that is probably the most rigorous to date, a paper called Anti-Realist Pluralism by Polzler and Wright. What they found there, at least among participants in the US, is that when they removed some of these methodological problems, they found that a substantial majority of the participants, about 3/4 across multiple different measures, tended to provide anti-realist responses to these sorts of questions. Polzler has collaborated in subsequent research with people to evaluate people in other countries, and they have continued to find that when you employ these better methods for evaluating people's responses to these questions, you get predominantly anti-realist responses. Now, do I think that that means that most of these participants are anti-realists? No, it does not. But what we don't find is clear evidence that most people are realists. The way I've interpreted this evidence is I started looking at how people interpret these questions. And what it looks like is that the vast majority of non-philosophers do not interpret questions about metaethics in the way that researchers intend, and in many cases, they don't interpret them to be metaethical questions at all. And that will become relevant to this process of elimination approach that Huemer is employing here. The issue here is that when you ask people questions about metaethics, they often interpret them as questions about their normative moral standards, or they interpret them as epistemic questions about what people are in a position to know. I don't have time here to go into detail. I did do an interview on Joe Schmid's channel, Majesty of Reason, where I went into some of the details about some of the methodological issues of this research. Now, from looking at that data, how I interpret it is that the reason non-philosophers give inconsistent replies and appear to interpret these questions in ways that don't comport with the researcher intent of these questions, which is to elicit realist and anti-realist intuitions, is that they don't know what they're being asked because they don't have these concepts and they don't employ these concepts. Now, that's a big empirical question, but the bottom line is, I don't think it's actually true that realism is a common sense view. Now, why might it look like a common sense view when we look at this process of elimination approach? Well, I think the underlying issue here, at least one of the key issues, is one related to language. And I think that when Huemer sets up these scenarios, they superficially look like they support the realist analysis, but I don't think that they actually do support the realist analysis. There's a few things to say about that. First, in all of the cases where we are evaluating whether or not the particular anti-realist position on the matter is plausible or not, or sounds right or not, we have to rely on our own judgments in these cases. And I don't share Huemer's intuitions about these cases. So at least one issue is that to a significant extent, from my understanding, Huemer relies on phenomenal conservatism. And even if we grant phenomenal conservatism as an appropriate epistemic tool for the sake of argument, and I understand that he could correct me if this isn't an accurate or adequate characterization, is that to the extent that something seems true, we have some sort of initial justification for believing that in the absence of defeaters. Now, if we grant that for the sake of argument, I have no problem with a realist saying when they look at these cases, it seems to them that like realism wins out in the analysis of these scenarios in the absence of defeaters. Of course, it could be that the anti-realist comes in and says, here's a bunch of arguments against realism, and then the realist goes, oh, okay, well, it seemed to me like realism is true, but these things override it. That isn't really the typical approach I would take. Rather, when I look at these cases, I don't have the realist seemings in the first place. And so that already puts us to a certain degree at an impasse unless we move past those defeaters. Part of the issue I have with phenomenal conservatism, there's a couple of them. One is that at best it only appears to provide, at least mostly, private justification. It doesn't provide justification in a way that is sort of publicly available to others. An example that I've given when I've discussed it before is, suppose I was wandering through the woods and I run across Bigfoot. Now, do I think Bigfoot exists? No. But suppose I did run across Bigfoot and spent a whole lot of time hung out with Bigfoot for like a week. Well, I would have good reason to believe Bigfoot existed. Like, let's say, I don't do drugs. I have no reason to think I was drugged. I'm with Bigfoot for long enough that it's really implausible this is a dream or I'm hallucinating. I don't take the radically skeptical view that, like, you could always be hallucinating. It's so implausible it could be Bigfoot. So in that position, I would say you're absolutely justified in believing Bigfoot. But once you left the woods and started telling other people I ran into Bigfoot, they would have no particularly good reason to believe you, no matter how good your testimony was, unless there were independent means of corroboration. So when a realist says that they have realist seemings, fine. I'm happy to grant that, but I don't have those seemings. And so then there's a question of, like, whose seemings are stronger here, or we have to start turning to the other arguments that don't just rely on realist seemings. And the issue I have with that is that in almost every instance in which realists present arguments for their view, there's at some point in the premises where the plausibility of the premises seems to depend on precisely those realist intuitions that I don't have and that I don't think most people have. If realists want to claim that the position is a commonsensical position, or that the preponderance of intuitions among non-philosophers are on their side, I don't think that they have a case for that, because I don't think that the empirical evidence supports that claim is true. Now, the next thing I want to do is turn to the approach Huemer's taken, which is this process of elimination approach. As I understand it in ethical intuitionism, he basically says that there's only three logically possible positions that are represented by each of these: non-cognitivism, error theory, and then a third category, which I think he does a good job of explaining how it's quite inclusive. So I think it's called subjectivism in the book, but I'm assuming it includes like constructivist views and other sorts of views, provided that they make the moral claims like stance dependent in some way rather than independent of stances. So it's not just necessarily cultural relativism and individual subjectivism. So I like those three categories because I do think that they represent the standard three categories in the literature. The problem is that I don't think that those are the only logically possible categories, and I reject all three of them. So when I describe my position, I typically call myself, at least these days, maybe it's not the best term, I'll have to come up with a better one, I call myself an anti-realist quietist. And the reason I call myself that is because when I look at the standard three positions, they all fundamentally rely on a semantic thesis. So non-cognitivism holds that moral claims are not propositional. Error theory holds that they are propositional and they do purport to describe these stance-independent facts. And then there's an additional metaphysical thesis that there are no such facts, so all of those claims are false. And then the subjectivist types of accounts hold that there are moral claims that are propositions, and that those claims are true, but they're true in a stance-dependent way. The problem is that when you look at what's being claimed when we're talking about what is the meaning of moral claims, well, if that's an analytic claim, then I don't think there's a fact of the matter about that. And I don't think that I'm required to endorse that there's a fact of the matter about that. So if it's supposed to be a claim that there's this category, moral claims, about which there's some sort of analytic fact of the matter about the meaning of the contents of the category as a whole, I just reject that, on metaphilosophical grounds. I reject that approach to philosophy. I don't think the meaning of moral claims is an analytic or a priori question that could be determined from the armchair. I endorse a view of language and meaning where facts about what people mean when they make claims are empirical questions about what the speaker is intending to communicate. So it's really, and there's more to it than that. It's not fully reducible to that. There might be other factors there, but I take it to be empirical questions that are determined exclusively in the context of usage in which they occur. And so I don't think that there is or could be plausibly any single fact of the matter about the meaning of moral claims. It could be that when one person uses moral claims, they're intending to express some non-propositional content. And it could be that when another person uses moral claims, they're making a propositional claim, either to refer to objective moral facts or stance-dependent facts of some kind. So I take that, at broad brush, I would take a sort of pluralist view that what people mean depends on what the speaker's trying to do in that particular instance. And it's even possible for individuals for there to be intrapersonal variation. So there might be instances in which, I say that's wrong, where it's just an exclamation, or I'm just trying to get someone to not do something, and it's functioning in a non-cognitive sense in that context. But in other contexts, I'm telling you something about my attitudes or values. So that's why, non-cognitivism, I actually would just agree with Huemer that it really struggles to account for instances where a person, is inserting a moral claim into a syllogism, or the reasoning like, well, what if I did this, or is this actually good? That seems a really weird way to handle some sort of crude emotivism. So I wouldn't endorse non-cognitivism, but that's because I take non-cognitivism to be overcommitted in its semantic analysis. It, as Michael Gill puts it, the traditional forms of non-cognitivism are subject to the uniformity and determinacy assumptions. They treat all moral claims as being uniform and determinately analyzed in non-cognitivist terms, and then that runs into problems, naturally. But the problem there, I don't think, is treating moral claims as non-propositional. It's treating all instances of statements like murder is wrong as non-propositional, which really isn't plausible when we can and do insert them into syllogisms. So the problem with the traditional three positions, I take it to be, is that either they're making these uniform and determinate analytic or a priori claims about the meaning of moral claims, and I reject that on sort of background grounds. I don't endorse the views of language or the views of concepts or the metaphilosophical views that would lead me to endorse any one of those positions. If we say, okay, well, we're going to set aside that specific conception of the way we analyze moral claims and instead look at moral claims in the empirical terms that comport with my views of language, then I would endorse folk metaethical indeterminacy. And if that's the case, then I don't think that there's any determinate fact of the matter about what people mean when they make these moral claims in most ordinary contexts. There might be special technical contexts. So when I make moral claims, I might speak like a relativist or a non-cognitivist in a lot of instances. I take it when moral realists make moral claims, they're purporting to describe stance-independent moral facts. But if what we're doing when we're talking about moral claims or ordinary moral discourse is we're looking at what non-philosophers mean, I think that in the vast majority of the cases, there is no determinate fact of the matter about whether what they're saying or thinking or doing determinately comports with a realist or an anti-realist analysis of any kind. And so to the extent that all three of the traditional categories rely on assumptions about the way language works or empirical assumptions about what the facts of the matter are about how non-philosophers think, I reject all three of those categories. And so my position falls outside of them. As a result, while I deny that there are stance-independent facts, I don't actually endorse any of those three categories. So I've said a bunch about that. The last thing I want to say about this is how we analyze the specific issues that Huemer cited. So we take the error theorist's position. So when we look at what an error theorist is saying, that you take some statement like it's wrong to torture babies for fun, and the error theorist says that statement is false. It's not true that it's wrong to torture babies for fun. Now, that might look absurd on its face, but I think it only looks absurd on its face when we stand outside the conditional presuppositions about what the error theorist is saying in that context. So what is the error theorist saying when they say it's not morally wrong to torture babies for fun? What they're saying is it is not the case that there are stance-independent moral facts such that it's morally wrong in that sense. Like, it's not stance-independently wrong to torture babies for fun. Now, is that implausible? Is that a common sense position that that's implausible? Well, I don't think it would be a common sense position that it's implausible, because I don't think that non-philosophers typically have a concept of stance independence or stance dependence, and it would be very hard to elicit that response in them without training them in philosophy. In other words, removing them from the category of non-philosophers whose judgments could be plausibly considered common sense. This is why, in my dissertation, it's called Schrodinger's categories. What I argue is that non-philosophers, with respect to many philosophical issues, exist in a state of philosophical superposition that's only collapsed by engaging in philosophy. So a person that doesn't have a concept of stance independence or dependence couldn't plausibly have a position on whether or not moral claims could be stance independently right or wrong, unless they understood that, and unless that you were able to elicit that understanding from them in a way that you could be confident that they understood what you were saying. Otherwise, you couldn't measure it anyway. So that is going to be a big issue, that we can't even determine what the common sense view is using sort of standard metrics and tools. Now, when you look at that statement, what I think is going on there is that the error theorist statement looks really implausible because of what it would ordinarily mean in ordinary context for a person to say, it's not wrong to torture babies. Think about a person out on the street and they say, hey, I don't think it's wrong to torture babies. I think that carries pragmatic implications about the person's character or attitude, about what they would be disposed to do. That person might be disinclined to vote against, laws that would help stop people from torturing babies. They might be indifferent if they found out their neighbor was torturing babies. It would carry all these pragmatic implications that are not entailed by what the error theorist is actually committed to. All the error theorist is committed to is saying something like this. Hey, most people, when they say stuff like it's wrong to torture babies, they're committed to this metaphysical presupposition. But that presupposition is false. So technically that claim is false. But that doesn't actually tell you anything about the error theorist's attitudes, beliefs, preferences, what they would do regarding torturing babies. I think that to the extent that Huemer's objections to error theory in this semantic analysis look plausible, they look plausible by relying on prompting people, including professional philosophers, to conflate normative claims with metaethical claims. And that's why I call it normative entanglement. It makes it look like the error theorist is committed to something horrific. It's implausible, so we have to reject it. Curiosity, it looks like you're talking, but you might be muted. I can't hear you.
You're able to hear me now, right? So I was
Yeah.
just reminding you of time constraints, and if you could quickly finish the
Yes.
opening statements. Yeah.
Okay, so are we done with the open statements?
Yeah. If you want to complete it with a sentence or two, then
Sure, I could complete it with a sentence. I think the same sort of issue applies to the subjectivist analysis as well. I think that normative entanglement emerges there too, where to the extent that a subjectivist looks like they're committed to saying, hey, if someone thinks it's okay to torture babies, it's okay to torture babies. I think that relies on failing to unpack the analysis. If you're an appraiser relativist, what you think when you say, if someone says it's okay to torture babies, what that means is that they approve of torturing babies, at least for an appraiser relativist. And that statement would just be trivially true. So it'd be really weird to say it's really implausible that if people say things like, I approve of torturing babies, and they do approve of torturing babies, that what they're saying is true, because that's just trivially true. Of course that's true. But that says nothing about whether you have to endorse them torturing babies. So I don't think appraiser relativism really falls to the semantic analysis so easily either.
Sure. Thank you so much, Lance, for the opening statement. And now we are getting into the open discussion phase of the debate. So, Mike, you can go ahead with your response to Lance's opening statement.
Yeah, good. So I guess I don't know. I guess I clarify some things that now I was saying, the anti-realists have these radically counterintuitive views or something. Now, my claim isn't that most people have a direct intuition that moral realism is true. So most people have never heard of moral realism, I don't think. And if you try to explain it to them, it's going to take a while for them to even understand what you're saying. And it doesn't seem hard to understand to us because we're like philosophy people and we're familiar with it. But if you just take a person off the street or an undergraduate and you try explaining to them, it'll take a while for them to even understand the question. So they might not have intuitions about that specifically. But so I'm trying to appeal to other intuitions that I think they would have, like you shouldn't torture babies for fun. So I claim that they have that intuition. And also that, it makes sense to say things like, well, if you shouldn't torture babies, then you shouldn't get your little brother to torture babies. Okay. And also, even if you like torturing babies, you still shouldn't do it. And so stuff like that. And then, the claim is that you could do some reasoning from common sense claims that would get you to moral realism, rather than that moral realism is itself immediately intuitive. Lance said that he didn't share my intuitions, but I wasn't sure which intuitions he meant. So, maybe clarify if, does he mean it doesn't seem to him like you shouldn't torture babies for fun, or like that doesn't seem true, or it does seem like it matters how you feel about it. So, like, you don't share the intuition that if you had different attitudes, it would still be wrong to torture them, or so. Just be more specific about that, I guess. Okay. Is there a fact of the matter? So Lance said they didn't think there was a fact of the matter about the meaning of moral claims, and I'm a little confused by that phrasing. There not being, I don't know what it means for there to not be a fact of the matter. Like we say the stuff, it's not meaningless, right? So it means something. But then I thought, well, maybe he just meant that it has different meanings in different contexts for different people. Okay, so that's okay, but I only need there to be like one context in which it means what I say, and it has a realist meaning, and it's plausibly true. Okay, so like when I say if it's wrong to do something and it's wrong to get your little brother to do it. Okay, so then that couldn't have the non-cognitivist meaning. So if there's just some context in which I could say that, and it would be plausibly true. Okay, and wrong doesn't express an emotion, and it doesn't refer to our attitudes. Okay, and then and it's also got to be a context in which it's plausible that that's true. But it's highly plausible that there are contexts in which all of that is the case. Let's say you're reading some of the ethics literature, and they're talking about whether abortion is wrong. All right, so they're clearly not just expressing their feelings or trying to influence your actions, and they're not just reporting their own attitudes. So it looks like it has a realist type meaning, right? And it's not some weird philosopher thing, like although it's philosophers talking like other people understand what they're doing, right? Arguing about whether abortion is wrong. Okay, and then you might think, oh yeah, but maybe the stuff they're saying there is false. Okay, but say in the course of this article about abortion, they're like, okay, so everyone agrees that murder is wrong. Now let's figure out whether abortion is like that, and then so where they say everyone agrees everyone agrees that murder is wrong. It looks like that has a realist meaning. In other words, it's not being used to express a feeling or try to influence people, and it's not reporting our attitudes. So, and looks like it's also true. Okay, so now, and then, if you're committed to saying, oh yeah, so in that context, that was just a false statement, then I think that's radically counterintuitive, I guess. And okay, okay, so then my argument against the error theorist is, oh well, you guys are committed to saying it's not wrong to torture babies. That seems crazy, right? Or when you're reading the article about abortion, they're like, everyone agrees murder is wrong, but is abortion really murder? Okay, only if fetuses are people or something like that, and they go on from there. And then if you're committed to saying, no, they were wrong when they said that, that murder is wrong. I think that's a crazy position. Now, And then Lance said something like, well, what the error theorist means is that there's not a stance independent fact about it. No, that's not what they mean. Right? What they mean is the ordinary statement, murder is wrong, is false, right? Because it's part of their theory that, like, the reason why they're error theorists and not non-cognitivists is that it's part of their theory that the ordinary statement means what the realist says that it means. Like, they agree with the realists about, how it's reporting a fact. So, okay, so yes, they're saying there isn't a stance independent fact, but they're also saying that that means that the ordinary statements are false. And so that means they're in conflict with common sense. So, okay, let's see. Did I get to everything I want to talk about? Let me see. And I don't know, I guess I'll just make a general remark about intuition and phenomenal conservatism. So my claim is, like, all of this discussion is based on our intuitions. Like, you don't have, there's not like a philosophy discussion in which you're not relying on your intuitions. It's just that sometimes you label them that, and sometimes you just intuit things without saying that they're intuitions, right? But so, that being the case, it seems like, you shouldn't accept a position that relies on less plausible intuitions, right, over one that relies on more plausible intuitions. Okay.
All right, Lance, you can go ahead with your response to that. It's an open discussion, so yeah.
Sure. Yeah, I was a little puzzled by the last thing because I thought I was quite clear in my characterization of error theory as being committed to both the semantic thesis, this claim about ordinary speakers, and that what they mean is that those people are wrong when they make those claims. In fact, that was actually part of my point about it not being the case that the error theorist is really committed to anything so egregious as it might seem. That's part of the point of normative entanglement. All they're committed to saying is, hey, those people over there, when they say that stuff, there's an implicit presupposition in what they're saying. That presupposition is false, and so those people are systematically mistaken. The issue here is that you give this statement like the error theorist is committed to saying that it's not morally wrong to torture babies. Sure, to the extent that they're committed to saying that, that's supposed to be crazy, to put it in your terms. I don't see why that's crazy, because all they're committed to saying when they say that is, to the extent that this statement is, as long as they're employing that language in the sense that ordinary people mean it, in the sense of what they think is a belief or an implicit commitment to there being stance independent facts, what they think makes that statement false is the commitment to stance independent facts. There's no other aspect of that they're denying. So the claim is both a normative claim, a claim about the rightness or wrongness of torturing babies or whatever it would be, and a metaethical claim. So if you look at if you imagine an exchange like a realist asks an atheist, hey, do you think it's or an error theorist in particular, hey, do you think it's morally wrong to torture babies for fun? Well, the error theorist, if they're responding to that by employing the language in the ordinary sense, the answer would have to be no. They can't say yes to that question. But notice if they say yes, they're saying yes simultaneously to both the metaethical question, whether there are any stance independent facts at all, and the normative question that they're opposed to torturing babies, that they think on normative grounds it's morally wrong. But if they say no, that's actually ambiguous between three possible positions that the person could hold. They could think that there are stance independent facts, but that the wrongness of torturing babies isn't among them. So they could say no, even though they're a realist, but they just think they think it's permissible to torture babies. They might think that they're saying no to both questions, so they could still think that it's okay to torture babies, but they also don't think there's stance independent facts. Or they might think something like what I would think, which is that I do think it's wrong to torture babies just for fun, but I don't think it's stance independently wrong. But if an error theorist is responding to that question, because the metaethical question and the normative question are bundled together, it can make it pragmatically implies, if they say no, that they're like an awful, terrible person. It's implying they're okay with baby torture, and that actually isn't an implication of error theory. An error theorist just isn't committed to being okay with baby torture. And I think the sense that the error theorist looks, quote unquote, crazy is because it looks like, to people that aren't being careful about what the error theorist is saying, that the error theorist is okay with baby torture. And they don't have to be. An error theorist could literally be out personally stopping people from torturing babies. They could be a crusader dedicated to stopping people from torturing babies with a far greater commitment than every realist on the planet. And they could still respond by saying, it's not morally wrong to torture babies. So, I don't know if we want to discuss that, or I should go through your list. I don't know the best way to handle this.
I don't know. Okay, so Yeah, so there's this error theorist who says, God, I absolutely hate baby torture, but it's not morally wrong. Okay, so now does that make their position plausible? Okay, so now, they've canceled the implication that they're okay with baby torture. So then that should eliminate any implausibility. And so then that derives from that. So, no, that still seems like a radically counterintuitive position, right?
Well, it doesn't seem that way to me.
Oh, okay.
I don't find anything remotely counterintuitive about that. Seems fine to me. I don't see what the problem would be. What I would have a problem with is if a person was okay with baby torture. I don't care if they deny stance-independent moral facts, because I don't find the notion of stance-independent moral facts to be remotely plausible. And so this is what happens in, like, we could just copy paste the same point about all of the scenarios that you where once you unpack, like, the subjective is saying, yeah, if a person says that it's morally okay to torture babies, that statement is true. All a appraiser relativist is committed to is saying, hey, when that person says it's okay to torture babies, what they mean is, I approve of torturing babies. And if the person approves of torturing babies, they might as well be saying, I approve of torturing babies. Well, of course that's true, but that says nothing about whether the appraiser relativist has to be okay with that person torturing babies. And so, again, I think the extent to which it prompts us to think that the appraiser relativist looks crazy is only by failing to disentangle failing to adopt their perspective and disentangle what they're committed to once you unpack the analysis versus interpreting it outside of that analysis. So it's the same sort of thing.
Well, okay, so we might have a clash of intuition. Let's say we we do have a clash of intuitions. Okay, but just like my intuitive reaction is just like, that's wrong. That should come out as a true statement. Now, I'm not assuming it's intuitive that is stance independent. I'm just assuming it's intuitive that it's true. And then you have to do a little bit more work to figure out whether it's stance independent or not. Okay. But, you might just think, what do we do if we just have different intuitions, at the end of the day? I don't know. And I believe that, in fact, there are a lot of anti-realists who are such because, moral realism just strikes them as counterintuitive. It's not just Lance. Like, I met other people who it seems that way. What do you do? I don't know, but it seems like there are more people with realist intuition. But I don't really know what to do if you have a clash of intuitions.
It doesn't seem that way to me. It doesn't seem to me that more people have realist intuitions. I mean, one is, like, I wrote my whole dissertation on this. Seems like most people don't have realist intuitions. It looks like if you survey analytic philosophers, a majority of them will respond to the Phil paper survey by saying, yes, they believe in moral realism. But if you look at the breakdown of that, you actually have a slightly more favor naturalist accounts of realism than non-naturalist accounts of realism. Now, you could lump naturalists and non-naturalists together, but in many ways, non-naturalists have greater affinity with anti-realists than they do with realists. They certainly don't have some sort of, like, Morean sense, or at least if they do, it may or may not serve any significant dialectical role in the way that they formulate their positions. They're just, like, naturalists are just not in the business of doing the same thing as non-naturalists. And I actually share many of the non-naturalist objections to naturalism. So to me, that actual scenario looks like a rock, paper, scissors breakdown of very, very different positions. I mean, to the extent that naturalists want to reduce moral claims to descriptive facts, they don't even believe in the kinds of authoritative, irreducibly normative facts non-naturalists do. And if you look at the other question on the Phil paper survey that breaks that survey down further, you get 26.6% of the philosophers responding to the survey endorsing non-naturalism and 26.1% endorsing anti-realism. And so you've got 0.5% more that favor your position over mine. That's not a big difference.
Well, okay, wait. I mean, naturalism counts as part of realism. Now, so I have objections to naturalism, but I don't think that I have a clash of intuitions with them. In a way, naturalism is similar to subjectivism. They're both reductionist theories, but the way that people think about it is, the main division is realism versus anti-realism, and naturalism goes on the realist side. And, if you took anti-realism and then you broke it down into more specific versions of anti-realism, then you can also get each of those having, And, like your specific position, you're the only person I know who says that. So you can get smaller percentages. But okay, my disagreement with the naturalist is basically I think that they don't have a good account of the epistemology. They think they do, and I think they're confused. And I think you have to go through some complicated reasoning to see why they're confused. Right? But I think if they accepted those arguments, then they would come over to non-naturalist realism. I think.
Yeah, you might not reject naturalism for the same reasons I do. I tend to be more favorable towards like triviality objections. I think if there were moral facts of the kinds the naturalist thinks that there are, I think I would kind of shrug at him in the way that if a non-naturalist is right, that would be something. But if a naturalist is right, okay. Now, I know that doesn't mean that the position isn't true, but typically when I talk about, false. Typically when I talk about realist positions, what I tend to argue for is what I've been calling a realist trilemma. I tend to argue that they're trivial, false, or unintelligible, and I typically just dismiss naturalist accounts as trivial. Whether or not they're true isn't that interesting to me. So we may have different reactions to that sort of scenario. So I do want to address some of the other things you say, though, if that's okay, because you did give a big list, and I feel like if I leave them unaddressed, that could be a problem for both of us.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. Okay. So one of the things you said was interesting is that you don't, if I'm understanding you, that you don't think most people have realist intuitions.
Well,
how would you frame that?
They wouldn't directly intuit realism. Like if you tell them, hey, there's this thing called moral realism, then you give them like a definition. I don't think they're going to just immediately think that that's obvious. I think you have to reason to it.
Right. Okay. So I totally agree with that. And if I gave the impression that I think that it's like I've somehow shown realism isn't the common sense position, because if you give a definition of people, they're not going to immediately wholeheartedly affirm it, because like they're not going to know. They're going to say, well, what is moral realism? What do you mean exactly by an objective fact? At least if they're being careful enough or be confident interpreting them. What I'm actually thinking is more that if they could be put in a state of understanding those questions, you're going to face a serious problem. One is that I'm not sure you can actually prompt them to understand the questions adequately to respond to them without them actually having sufficient training, education, or understanding of philosophical problems. And in that case, they're not really members of the population non-philosophers or people whose judgments we could consider common sense. So now they've been trained in philosophy. The second problem is that if you then induce them to understand the questions adequately, you run a significant epistemic risk of like this. I'm not saying that they wouldn't necessarily take a position on the matter, but it would be very hard to know whether or not their response was indicative of what they would have thought prior to training, because you could bias them towards a particular view. So, when I ask students in my class, and I think this is pretty common for instructors, I get a bunch of anti-realist students. Like I've had it being unanimous that students say there's some type of relativism or anti-realism. I don't immediately just assume they're all anti-realists. I assume a lot of them are not really sure what's at stake there. A lot of times, if you ask them, they'll say like, oh, well, I think we need to tolerate other people, or they'll make these descriptive claims. So different people have different values. I'm actually curious if you have a similar experience, that people will give this like superficial anti-realism, but if you start picking at it, it doesn't really look like anti-realism.
No, I think that's right. I think they have a hard time getting the question. So focusing on the question that you want them to focus on. And they will say these other things about toleration it's very common to substitute a descriptive issue. Like they think you're asking whether people have different beliefs. No, that's not what I'm asking.
Yeah. Well, and this is actually borne out in my data. I ask people open response questions about what they think it means. And a lot of times people will say, oh, it means different people have different beliefs, or it means you should tolerate people with different values. So they tend to give these other sorts of responses. So the issue I have, the issue I have is that I don't think we're in a position to figure out what non-philosophers think about these issues in a way where we could be confident that their judgments aren't simply skewed towards whatever sort of training or education they receive. So there's a good chance that different ways of presenting the corpus of philosophy to people could incline people towards realism or anti-realism. We look at just the state of the field in the 1920s or 30s. My understanding from at least anecdotal reports from philosophers around at the time is that like non-cognitivism was super popular. Most people were anti-realists, and that's changed. And so it could very well
Okay.
be many students in this classes could be inclined towards anti-realism as a result of the teachers skewing the way that they presented things to
Yeah.
students. I don't know if you would agree with that.
Yeah, yeah. Well, anecdotally, my experience is like when I hear from other professors about what most students think, there's a surprising correlation between what most students think and what that professor's own views are. And my explanation is that the students are able to somehow detect what the professor thinks, even though he didn't say it. And then they tell the professor what, what they think he wants to hear. And they probably don't have very serious views. Like most of the time, they're like, I don't know this philosophy stuff, whatever. I'll say whatever he wants.
Right. I suspect you might be right about that. I've thought something kind of similar, that somehow students, I think, at least they're making guesses as to what they think the instructor thinks. And as long as it's more than 50% chance that they're right, that's going to skew the results, at least if it's a dichotomy, in favor of the instructor, like them, their responses correlating with the instructor position. It is testable. That'd be a cool thing to test, actually, for survey students. Maybe it's something I'll put on the list. The other thing you'd asked about that I do think is worth clarifying is me saying that there's no fact of the matter. There's a few, that was a very, there's several ways of disambiguating that. So I mean actually several things at once. It's really not a good way for me to frame things. The main thing that I would say, and you might even just agree with this, or maybe you wouldn't, I don't know, is that when people make moral claims, like in the ordinary sense, so I go out and I find a person saying murder is wrong. I don't think from looking just at that specific instance that it would be, there's going to be two issues. One is that I don't think there's a fact of the matter about whether that person is committed to any specific form of realism or anti-realism. And the second is that at the very least, I think any attempt at trying to understand what they might mean would be underdetermined by the evidence in most cases. Like you just wouldn't be able to actually figure out what that person is trying to say in most of those contexts. So there's that aspect of it, which is that I don't think people have determinate commitments or stances with respect to realist and anti-realist views. I don't think it means they don't mean anything. That'd be a ridiculous claim. Like when people say murder is wrong, they just don't mean anything at all. I think that when we're looking at what people mean, the way I look at meaning is I would say, well, what is the person trying to do? What are they trying to communicate themselves? And then I would cash out what they mean in that context in those terms. And for me, since meaning is determined holistically in its context of usage, I wouldn't throw out the pragmatics with as the bathwater of the semantic baby. I think if to the extent that there's even a distinction to make there, you got to bundle it all together, and that a significant part of community, like pragmatics, is not just this like extra stuff on the side. I think it's a big part of what people are doing. So even in a case where a person would, by stipulation, be asserting a proposition like murder is wrong, in any actual context where they're talking, or like say people are arguing about abortion, even if you're a realist arguing for abortion, they're not just trying to like state propositions without a purpose, without a goal. Like a person that's like, look, abortion is wrong. They're trying to persuade other people. And so there are these pragmatic things that sort of latch on to even if it is a propositional claim. And those are coming along for the ride. And they're also expressing those things. And it's a common thing that's worth pointing out to like undergrads. Like a realist is not making a claim that when a person makes a moral claim, that they're only conveying semantic content about the stance of independent facts. They could also be expressing stuff. It's just that they're not only expressing stuff. And so for me, when we look at what people are what the meaning of ordinary moral claims, we could remove the realist and anti-realist stuff, and then there's whatever else is left over. So they certainly mean things. It's just an empirical question what they mean. Sorry, I said a lot there. So I'll stop there.
Good. Okay, so yeah, this is coming into focus more. So, as I understand it, so you would respond to my my example of like how it's wrong to torture babies by saying, well, yeah, maybe actually it isn't wrong to torture babies, but the implausibility of that sentence derives from the like pragmatic implications, which are always there, even if you're a realist. And it doesn't derive from the whatever the cognitive semantic content. And I guess, and my attempt to get around that is to imagine that you have a context in which you neutralize the usual pragmatic implications, right? By just saying, no, like, and I don't want people to torture babies. Don't torture babies, okay? I don't, because I hate it, but it is not wrong to do it. And then I claim that that's implausible, but then you're going to say that it's not implausible anymore.
Right, that sounds right. Yeah, I would not claim it's implausible. And I would also make the further claim that I don't think if you could somehow, maybe this is just not demonstrable with current Earth technology. I suspect at least some people that would say in those cases that it's implausible. They're still subject to the pragmatic influences, like the implications are somehow influencing them. I can't demonstrate that though. I can't read your mind or anyone else's mind. And you may have considered this position, far more than the vast majority of people. So if you're saying it's not the pragmatics, fine, take your word for it. But for most people, I don't know the answer to that question. I don't know if they would favor my side or your side. And so at the very least, I would be very hesitant to say that the realist position, even under these like special circumstances where we're removing the pragmatic influences and we're extracting the language from those contexts and we're putting it in some special context.
Yeah.
I don't know the answer to what the preponderance of people would favor under those conditions, even if we look at the Bill papers data, because I don't know the facts about the degree to which those people are subject to these sorts of influences.
Yeah.
And I don't think anyone else does either. We haven't done that research. I don't know how good philosophers are at holding pragmatic influences in abeyance, to what extent and how systematically they are capable of doing so, nor do I know if the extent to which they're capable of doing so is operational when they're answering those questions. Like when they're filling out the Phil paper survey, are they holding that stuff constant? I don't know. I don't think anyone knows. So I would at least push back against the notion that realism is first of all, I certainly don't think most non-philosophers are realists. But even in the cases where one wants to claim it's like the most plausible position by the preponderance of philosophers, I'm skeptical even there.
Yeah. So I wonder if you think axiological judgments go the same way as deontic judgments, and I think this might be worth thinking about because, there's some people like I have a colleague who doesn't believe in obligation. He just believes in good and bad. Right? This is Alistair Norcross. So he thinks actions are better or worse than other actions, but there's no obligatoriness. Okay. Okay. So, you imagine somebody saying, well, like pain is bad. We could put some qualification, whatever, pro tanto, intrinsically bad. And then, okay, but, obviously I don't like it. So imagine somebody saying, pain isn't bad. I just don't like it. And, does that seem implausible? Or would you say that sounds fine?
Yeah, so this actually goes back to some of the other stuff you said, but I'll just address this. What I would say about this is it depends what you mean when you say pain is bad. So, in a lot of cases, it looked like you were telling me that like you just want this intuition about whether the statement is true, not necessarily in the non-naturalist sense, but I don't know how to have an intuition about like an undifferentiated conception of truth. Like it's true in some sense, but we'll leave open what sense in which it's true. The sense in which I would think it's true would be contingent on what it would mean for it to be true, like true in some anti-realist sense or true in some realist sense. So if you unpacked true, like in an anti-realist sense, like some subjectivist sense, like, hey, does it seem to you that torturing babies is wrong, that you disapprove of it? And it's true in the sense that if you were to say it's wrong, you would be saying you disapprove of it. Absolutely. Of course I would say that's true. But what about in the stance-independent sense? Then no. It's the same thing here. It depends what you mean by bad. So if by bad, you mean bad in some sort of like I don't like this language, but like intrinsic sense or a sense where it would be bad independent of whether I regarded it as bad, then the answer would be no. The problem is that someone could just stipulate that by what they mean by bad just is a thing that as a matter of stipulation is disapproved of by the person experiencing it. And then in that sense, of course, I'd say it seems bad, but then it would be trivial. So, there might be other interpretations. The problem is that when you take these like normative or evaluative claims and you don't unpack the presuppositions behind them, I can't give a determinant that seems true or that seems false. I need to know what the presupposition is.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Okay, good. So this is a good question. Like, can you have intuitions about whether some statement is true or false independent of on account of what it means? So, you might think it might seem plausible that no, you can't. Like somebody has to tell you what it means. Then they either give you a realist analysis or an anti-realist analysis, and whichever they do, it makes the intuition useless for making the argument, right? And so I want to say no, you can have an intuition about whether something is true without specifying the analysis of it. Okay, so and actually this is important for the conduct of analytic philosophy. This is important for a philosophical method, right? So, like think about the definition of knowledge, and the traditional definition is knowledge is justified true belief or something, and then Gettier comes along and refutes this by giving these examples. And so he didn't give this example, but a better example than Gettier's examples is the stopped clock. So you're looking at a clock, it says 3 o'clock, you justifiably believe that it's 3 o'clock. The clock, unbeknownst to you, is stopped. It's a broken clock. This, back when they used to have analog clocks. Okay. But coincidentally, it happens to be stopped at the time that it actually is when you're looking at it. Okay. So did you know what time it is? Okay. So, and then almost everyone intuits that you didn't know that. Okay. And then that refutes the justified true belief analysis of knowledge. Now, imagine somebody saying, well, no, I can't have intuitions about that without you telling me what you mean by no. So if you mean no in the sense of justified true belief, then I intuit that he does know. And if you mean no in the sense of some other analysis, then I intuit that he doesn't know. Okay, and so then that just makes that makes this example useless, right, for refuting a definition, right?
Yeah, so the issue with that is I actually do think Gettier cases are pretty much useless. So, one of the things you said is that this is important for like analytic philosophy, but I largely reject much of the metaphilosophical presuppositions that are characteristic of most analytic philosophy. So, I'm more in the pragmatist and radical empiricist approach to philosophy as a whole, and I think that these conceptual questions are fundamentally misguided in their approach. When I look at Gettier cases, I don't think that it's a reasonable question to ask, would I know? Because I don't think it's clear what is being asked. Like, would I use the word no in that context? Like, if you're asking me a question about what my disposition to use words is, I don't think that's particularly dispositive of any particular analytic truths about the nature of knowledge, because I don't think, one, I don't think there are truths of that kind. And two, I don't think that if there were, that this would be an appropriate method for finding out what those truths were.
Wait, can you clarify, what do you mean there aren't truths of that kind? Like, there aren't truths about what we know, or?
Yeah, I don't think that I think the word no is a word in the English language. It's a polysemous word. It's used in a variety of ways. I don't think that there's any specific phenomena knowledge to which we could figure out what does or doesn't count as knowledge. Like, I don't think that we could stipulate what we mean by knowledge. We can offer accounts by what we mean by knowledge. But I don't think there's a fact of the matter about what knowledge is in such a way that it corresponds to the English use of the term, because, I don't think words and concepts work that way. So I could be wrong about that, but at least one point I would want to emphasize, going back to the process of elimination approach that you employed against anti-realism, is that even if my metaphilosophical presuppositions are totally mistaken, and they certainly could be, they at least seem to me to represent a logically possible position that one could take in the space of anti-realism and in this space with respect to questions about knowledge. It looks like the possibility space that you are restricting things to is taking on board assumptions about the analytic philosophical method, which might not be totally appropriate. Like, you have to have some constraints on things. You can't just have every metaphilosophy on the table. But since I fall to at least a certain extent outside the metaphilosophical approach you take, I do think that might be the root of our differences. That I have different views about human psychology and what intuitions are and how they work, and what language is and how that works. And so when you have all our foundations are totally different, it shouldn't be a surprise that we end up in very different places.
Yeah, good. Okay. Well, okay, so I wasn't expecting disagreement to go that deep, so I don't know what to do at that point. When you tell people about the Gettier example, like, I think a large majority of people just have the intuitive reaction that you're supposed to have. So I guess, like, do you have something to say about that? Like, why?
Yeah, so I don't know what's going on in those cases, but I do think it's an empirical question. What kinds of psychological processes are being prompted in those cases? I can tell you my own reaction to, at the very least, like the trolley problem when I initially encountered it. I can't exactly recall my response to the Gettier problem. But I recall, I remember this was Intro to Ethics course. I was at Florida Atlantic University, and I was in the class with the trolley problem. And maybe it's one of those flashbulb memories that's partially confabulated, but whatever. My reaction was, well, when I got to the footbridge case, was like, well, I wouldn't want to push the person off the footbridge, but I would feel bad about it, but it would maximize utility. And so I didn't have this immediate like, oh, it's wrong, oh, it's right. I just was aware of the options and what their implications were. And I have a similar reaction to many philosophical problems. And this isn't like a coincidence. Part of the reason I ended up going into philosophy is because I was really, interested in the fact that I had a different reaction to most of the students in my class, which is that I consistently did not have any definitive intuitive reaction to a significant majority of philosophical cases. Same thing with like the violinist case, maybe the Gettier. Again, I don't recall how I reacted to that. So I at least didn't have that reaction. Now, I could just be psychologically idiosyncratic. I could be the weird outlier. And it could sure look like I am if most of the students in a class react in a certain way. My concern, and again, this is somewhat speculative, but if I'm going to make such radically divergent claims from what most analytic philosophers are, I am going to have to go out on a limb on certain sorts of things. And if I'm leaning heavily on empirical claims that I don't yet have support for, I do have to engage in a bit of hypothesizing. I can tell you what I suspect is happening. What I suspect is happening in many philosophy courses is that people are being inducted into a mode of thinking and speaking that is idiosyncratic and specific to the enterprise of contemporary, like Anglophone philosophy. So I think students are basically being taught to have intuitions in these cases. They're being taught to get the sense that they have certain sorts of experiences or feelings that may or may not be representative of deep universal psychological states. Very much in the sense, like, if I decided to like pretend to be a guru, I bet I could have a class where I teach people to think that they could see auras, but they can't actually see auras. They would start reporting these phenomenological. It would be like pseudo phenomenology, and I think that sort of thing could be going on. And in fact, in some cases, I think it is going on with people that are trained in analytic philosophy. I think that they are disposed to think that they're having certain sorts of experiences, but I think that they misconstrue the nature of those experiences or what sorts of things can be inferred from those experiences. So I think a lot of students are basically prompted to have intuitions, and it's really just the context in which they're in that's causing them to think that way.
Yeah, good. Okay. Well, this is interesting. About the trolley examples, I mean, like I myself think those are difficult cases. So I share the intuitions that you're supposed to have about all those cases, but I see how you could see it another way. So I wouldn't want to put a lot of weight on it. And I could see how somebody could think. I see Alistair Norcross's point of view. I could see how you could think, no, there isn't really anything about obligation. There's only just like better and worse outcomes, whatever. But I have a stronger reaction to Gettier cases and things like that, right? Which I think is sort of standard. That in epistemology, like almost everyone thinks the Gettier intuitions are correct, and they refute the traditional analysis. In the trolley cases, like there's a substantial number of people, right? Minority, but there's a substantial number of people who think you shouldn't turn the trolley. And there's a substantial number of people who think you should push the fat man off the bridge or whatever. So, but I wanted to say, like a lot of these examples, like you could give them to students who like they're just starting, right? So like it's hard to say that I've trained them into this. Like it could be the first day of class, I give them the trolley example, and then go, "What do you guys think?" And just like 70% of them say, "Turn the trolley." Give them the organ harvesting, like everyone except two people says you can't harvest the organs. There's like two weird guys in the back or something. Right. So it doesn't look like I train people to have these intuitions.
Yeah. Well, one thing I want to address before I get to that, it was the statement about truth and like saying that, because I said, I don't think I could respond to a question about an undifferentiated notion of truth. What I think at the very least could be going on in those sorts of cases, like, is this true? And in the Gettier case, is that when you ask people the question, you're prompting them to, I think, fill in the blank if there's not enough context. So if you ask me in most ordinary context, do I think like the statement it's wrong to torture babies is true? In most ordinary contexts, I would say, yeah. And then if you ask me, I would give you like something that would look like a subjectivist analysis. But that would just be describing my own use of the language. I wouldn't be trying to make a further claim about like the meaning of moral claims. Like I wouldn't take myself to be committed to like, and that's how everybody speaks. Like I don't think everybody speaks like a subjectivist. I'd actually agree with you that that would sound very silly in a lot of contexts because you can. I don't know that we need to conduct a study to think it very plausible that if we went and look, there'd be cases where people say stuff like, I don't care if that culture approves of it, I don't approve of it. And so that person's not some kind of agent relativist or agent culture relativist. Or there might be somebody that would say, well, it'd still be wrong even if I thought otherwise. Like I can imagine people saying stuff like that. And they might be in some sense like proto-realists or at least proto-not relativists. I'm fine with that. And the same thing in the Gettier case. Now, as far as this question, well, first, I agree with you about the trolley problem in the Gettier case as being different. I know Josh Green has done a bunch of research on that. I think it's about 10 to 20% don't pull the switch, and then about 10 or 20% would push in the flip bridge. And I was almost laughing because I had a very similar breakdown of the percentages when I gave the Oregon case. Actually, I think that maybe a student brought it up because I think one person was okay with it out of the whole class. So the numbers actually track for me the same as for you. Yeah. But I also grant, like in the Gettier case, I know there's like a couple philosophers that are like, justified true belief, that's knowledge, good enough. But there's not a lot. And I actually don't know the numbers. I know it's actually largely considered like the first experimental philosophy paper, the Weinberg-Nichols-Stitch paper on Gettier problems, or at least I think it's Gettier problems. I don't remember the numbers there. It wouldn't surprise me if non-philosophers didn't have quite that unanimity on saying it's not knowledge in those cases, but it's probably high. It'd be weird if it wasn't. I don't know where the data is on the cross-cultural stuff. Some of the studies didn't replicate, and then they did find people. This tended to be fairly consistent cross-cultures. I don't know. In those cases, though, the question for me is like, what are people being prompted to do? Because if you're giving someone an undifferentiated case, like it's, in other words, the particular key axis, the crux of what the thing is turning on, is it wrong? Is it true? If it's open to multiple interpretations, it may be that people either lean on some pragmatic response, like what would I do in that case, or something like that, or they might spontaneously generate a particular analysis, but then it's an open empirical question what that analysis is. And it might just be that when people are presented with these cases in particular contexts, there's a tendency for most people to lean one way or the other. And it could spuriously correlate with where philosophers end up or something like that. I don't know. Again, I take a lot of these to be empirical questions. And in some languages, you might not be able to get the same kinds of results. So some languages, when a person makes knowledge claims, they're appended as a sort of grammatical construction to where the source of knowledge came from. And so it might be that when a person says, they wouldn't just say, I know that it's raining outside. They would say something like, it's raining outside because I could see that it's raining outside, or it's raining outside according to
I see that. I perceive that.
Yeah, I perceive that. And so the structure of the language might make Gettier cases really difficult in some languages. It doesn't mean you couldn't prompt it, because I don't think language makes people incapable of thinking certain things. But I do think that there's a big barrier between what people think and what they say. And I think that that's a difficult bridge to divide, and that analytic philosophy has overemphasized English. I mean, there's 7,000 plus languages in the world. And I think that the intuitive response that people have to cases plausibly would differ in many of these languages.
Yeah, good. Okay. Yeah, so so you mentioned that I don't know, maybe students would have less agreement than philosophers do in the Gettier case, and that's plausible. And my proposed explanation of that is, well, the students don't understand as well. Philosophers are smarter. They understand the concepts and they understand the question better. And it might be that you get different intuitions in other cultures, and I don't know if that's true, but it might be. Maybe other cultures or other languages actually have a different concept. Like we got the concept knowledge, and there's a word in this other language that we translate as knowledge, but doesn't exactly mean knowledge. Just means something close to that. And maybe justified true belief is true about that, or something, or closer to being true about that other concept. I don't know. Now, of course, at that point, you might wonder, well, then why are we so focused on our concept, right? If it's just one of many concepts that they have in different cultures. That's a good point. We might be, if it doesn't, if our concept doesn't translate into the concepts other cultures are using, then I think that suggests that it's not that philosophically interesting. Although I would still insist that we have the correct judgments about this perhaps not interesting category.
Well, something to say about that is that there have been a couple papers that argue that there's no cognate terms for morality in the Mongolian language. I'm not in a position to evaluate that sort of evidence, but it looks like they employ a different set of normative terminology. Again, not in a position to evaluate that. I'm not an expert on cross-cultural research or like cultural anthropology. But that at least is an interesting finding worth looking at. And, if I could at least, oftentimes, because I take a more empiricist approach to things, you take a more rationalist approach to things, often I get the sense that rationalistically inclined philosophers are less enthusiastic about empirical findings and their philosophical relevance. And look, I'm happy to grant before you even say this. In many cases, I'm just on board with those objections because I think a lot of people that appeal to empirical data to address philosophical questions do so in ways that are sloppy and a little too quick. So, like, I liked some of the critiques of like Josh Green's attempt to appeal to his neuroscientific data to support utilitarianism or at least some type of consequentialism. I think Celine Berker. I think there were a few people that had criticism. Some of these are pretty good. So I like some of that stuff. But if you take some of this empirical data to be philosophically relevant, that to me, even if because we're coming from such different places, I don't think at the end of our lives either of us are likely to have converged on the other's position. But I would at least like philosophy to take on board more of the empirical data insofar as it's relevant.
Yeah, no, seems right. I'm a rationalist at heart or something. I'm a natural rationalist, but I also think that philosophers have ignored empirical evidence too much. Just because we like sitting in the armchair. Okay, but that was very interesting. You mentioned about the Mongolian culture, but I don't know any of the evidence about that. So I want to hear more about that, but I guess we don't know more right now. I do think, though, looking at ancient Greek philosophy, it does seem to me like they're using different concepts from us. They're not completely different. They're not totally unrelated, but like they have all these arguments about like excellence. What is excellence? And then we translate that as like virtue or something like that. It's not really what we mean by virtue. So what do we think about that? And like, okay, does that mean that our particular concepts are parochial and so they don't matter? Maybe. I mean, maybe we should rethink some of our thick moral concepts, right? We still have thin moral concepts, right? So, there's just like better and worse, right? And like they clearly have that, right? Even if they don't have our concept of virtue, because that's kind of thick, because it's got sort of like presuppositions built into it that might be wrong, like normative presuppositions. So, yeah.
Yeah. So first, I put the reference to the paper. The paper is called Mongolian. I don't know how to pronounce this. Yos Sertakun and Weird Morality. So I could send you a link later if you want to look at the paper. Again, I'm not saying this paper is like settled the matter. No one should take one paper to definitively resolve empirical questions.
Yeah.
But one thing I would just say is I don't take the results of this empirical data to be dispositive on the question of whether there are like some form of normative realism is correct. We might have to offer some revisionary characterization of quote unquote morality if it's not this universally shared term or something like that. That's fine because I'm still a normative anti-realist, a global normative anti-realist, so I'm still on the hook for rejecting whatever these thin concepts would be anyway. So it's I don't take technically I take the position of Mashery and Stitch. I think that the very concept of morality is a sort of historical construction, that there is no definitive way to delineate moral from non-moral norms. But I don't think that is particularly important to the dispute between moral realism and anti-realism. Because realists could always just say, look, whatever we do with the language of morality, I still think that there are stance-independent evaluative facts or stance-independent, it's stance-independently true that you have an obligation to not do this, and you have a reason not to do it. So I still think there could be facts of that kind conditional on like what I'm saying here. So just in case, I'm not taking this to be some sort of critique.
Yeah, good. Yeah. So that reminds me that I sometimes think that the way that philosophers are using morality is different from the way that ordinary people are using it. And ordinary people's use of morality is thicker, right? Meaning that it's got more presuppositions built into it. And then I noticed that, I looked through the Bible one time, or I did a word search in the Bible for cognates of the word immoral. And as far as I could tell, there was not a single instance where it didn't refer to sexual behavior. There's a lot of and it depends on the translation, actually. So some translations don't have immoral at all. But if it does have immoral, it's almost always in the phrase sexual immorality. and the things that they're calling immoral are things that philosophers would consider not at all immoral. And they would think that it's crazy that you would say that was a paradigm of immorality. So anyway, but this isn't so relevant to our debate because we're not disputing about that. Like your skepticism about morality is not tied to that, not having the wrong moral norms. But I can see being skeptical about sort of traditional morality, where it's like what's immoral is having sex with the wrong people, and if that was what you thought were the paradigms, I could see why you might think, this is bullshit. Right. But that still leaves you with there are better and worse outcomes and things like that. And there's a reason to bring about the better outcomes and so on.
Sure, Lance, would you like to continue in some other avenue?
I thought you were going to have some questions forward. Curiosity.
Should we go into the questions now?
I think we reached a good point. Because we can't talk all day. I don't know how much time we have. Right. An hour and a half. So I think
we've already gone a lot deep into the debate that I didn't think we would go this deep. So, but that was interesting. It's fascinating. I can listen to you guys all day long, but because of time constraints, I think we can get to questions if you both are ready for that.
Sure. Yeah. Do we have time?
Right, cool.
I'm okay with that.
Yeah.
So let's start the question answer session. I got a lot of questions in Discord servers and in my YouTube video that I posted, but I can't obviously question them all of those questions. I've got 4 for each of you guys that I've selected from all those, and the reason I've selected those is either because some of them would be so simple and easy and you guys would already have answered those questions in talks with me and even in your previous videos, or they're too complex or too lengthy that it would take a lot of time. I've got 8 questions, 4 questions for each of you guys. So the first question would be for Dr. Huemer. Jonas Jensen 9305 asks, pertaining to the difference between ethical intuition and preference, most people would be extremely averse to putting a puppy in boiling water. On your view, this is due to an ethical intuition against doing so. Most people would similarly be extremely averse to putting their own hand in boiling water. Presumably, as a libertarian, you hold that people are entitled to inflict excruciating pain on themselves. Thus, this aversion doesn't indicate an ethical truth, but a mere preference.
Yeah.
So we have 2 attitudes held by all normal people, but one points to an objective ethical truth, while the other one doesn't. So his question is, how do you know your aversion to boiling a pup is an ethical intuition, distinct from the kind of aversion you have to boiling your own hand?
Yeah. Well, I mean, so first,
just to complete the question, why not apply Occam's razor and just have one type of aversion in our understanding of decision making?
Right. Well, okay, because the one type of aversion doesn't apply to the other case. Okay. So the reason I don't want to put my hand in the water is, self-interest, it would be painful. And when I put the puppy in the water, it'll be painful to the puppy. But the question is, why do I care about that? It won't be painful to me. And so there's a different motivation in the case of the puppy. Okay. But, there could be multiple motivations. So it could be, the puppy's cute and you like puppies. Right. And so if it's an ugly puppy, people would be more, they would be less averse, right? So like most normal people still wouldn't throw an ugly puppy, but they would, it would bother them less than throwing a cute puppy. And so that shows that it's not just your moral judgment. It's plausible that there is partly moral judgment. Now, I think, but like in this particular case, like, well, you'd have an emotional reaction, which could motivate your decision without a moral judgment. So better examples would be, well, there are cases where you do something where like it just doesn't look like you have the emotion supporting it. So like, let's say, you promise to do something and then you just think that you're obligated to do it and you don't want to do it. Right. And like, maybe like the person you made the promise to, you don't even like them. So like if you broke the promise, you would actually you wouldn't feel bad. You'd feel good that you broke it, but you still feel, okay, well, I got to do it. I promise I'll do it. Okay. So like those might be better examples. And, you can do some introspection to just like see that it doesn't appear that you have the same phenomenology in all cases.
All right. Okay, and the first question for Dr. Lance Bush. Poggy Woggy asks, many people have a sense that something being subjective makes it less important in some way, or that it makes one's judgments less authoritative. It's common to hear things like, it's subjective, it's an opinion, it's just an opinion, it's just a preference. Morality, on the other hand, is something of greater importance that people feel very strongly about. Does this indicate that anti-realist accounts of morality are missing something?
Well, certainly realists would think so, but I don't. So part of the issue is when people say stuff like just a subjective preference, that's already using loaded language that gives some sort of implication that something that is just subjective. It almost sounds like they're saying it's like quantitatively less than the sense in which a realist thinks things are good or bad. But this is not a quantitative difference; it's a qualitative difference. And whether or not and to what extent one regards the qualitative difference as meaningful or important is itself something that I wouldn't be able to make sense of other than in some sort of subjective way. So for me, at least, if there were stance-independent moral facts, I don't think I would care about them. I don't know what would happen if I actually became a moral realist. But when I act, I'm trying to act in accord with my goals and preferences. I'm not trying to comport my actions with stance-independent moral facts. And so I don't care about them. So if someone said, "Oh, well, that's just your preference," it's out of the court of the stance-independent facts. Well, what if the stance-independent moral facts were misaligned with my preferences? Well, too bad for those facts. I'm going to act in accord with my preferences. So for me, at least, there's nothing less about preferences because I don't care about stance-independent facts. But if someone cares about comporting their action with stance-independent facts more than they care about comporting their actions with their preferences in some specific context, then they may feel that pull. But that person may already be inclined to feel the realist pull to begin with. But the issue there is that what is doing the sort of motivational lifting is that person's motivations, that person's own goals or desires to comply with these stance-independent moral facts. So, I don't take it to be a necessary feature of moral realism that it has any sort of built-in motivational component. And to the extent that it has some sort of external one, like there's supposed to be this authoritative element to non-natural moral facts, to me, that I'm not even sure that that's intelligible. Like to say that they have authority over. Okay, well, what if I don't comply with them? What are they going to do? Are they going to? Am I going to get struck with a priori lightning? No, like nothing's going to happen to me. So you could just ignore the non-natural moral facts and nothing happens. So I don't think anti-realists are missing anything in those cases. I think that people have somehow become attached to this idea that if these facts are external to themselves, these normative facts are external to themselves, that somehow makes them better in some inchoate sense that I'm not even, what could that possibly mean? I think it's a total mystery. So no, I actually think in this case, it's realists that are conceptually, or people disposed towards thinking realism has something going for it that are conceptually confused, and that anti-realists aren't missing anything. The last point I'll make about that is simply that, when I think about like my food preferences, if someone told me, oh, well, why do you even care about eating this food you find delicious and healthy and ethically sourced and all this stuff, like you could set aside all the other issues, just the pure gastronomic facts, like one really tasty meal versus a pile of garbage. Well, you just subjectively prefer it good enough for me. Like, I don't think anything would be added by saying that the food, it's a gastronomic fact that the food is good. And, why would that matter? So, yeah, I think you can kind of do these reverse intuitions where you show that there are many contexts in which people are already disposed to at least not think in distinctively realist terms. It would be really puzzling to say that taking a subjective stance on some normative or evaluative matter is somehow like lesser than some sort of realist construal.
I saw Mike laughing there. I mean, do you have any response to that? Sorry to break the flow of questions. You
Oh,
might be having some response to that.
I don't know. I didn't think I was going to have to answer that one. Yeah. Is there some additional authority? I don't know. I guess people feel like if the moral truths depended on your preferences, then you can just choose to not do the thing, right? So you could just decide, and then there won't be any problem because, like, you're only going against your own preferences, whatever. Like, for one thing, morally, you're allowed to go against your preferences, but also, like, what would be the motivation? Like, if you don't want to do the thing, and then somebody tells you that it's morally required, but what they mean by that is they're claiming that somehow it serves your preferences, then you should just ignore that. So they're sort of like, I don't know, like the way that the objective factor is supposed to be better is partly being harder to escape. I guess that's part of it. Oh, the other thing is, like, a bunch of moral realists think that there's this thing that the moral reasons outweigh the prudential reasons. Like, I don't know if that's always true, but they think, like, whatever you have the most prudential reason to do A, you have most moral reason to do B. Then in that situation, overall, you just have most reason to do B. Which wouldn't be true if the moral reasons just come from your preferences.
Yeah. All right. So the second question for Mike. Spooky Ladouchi asks, do you think a reason internalism view, such as metaethical constructivism, maybe Kantian constructivism, which holds that there are public moral reasons independent of the stances of any particular individuals, which govern the entire moral community of rational agents, is a realist view, or does a moral realist have to believe that there are external moral properties in addition to stance-independent moral reasons?
I'm not sure. I don't want to sound too much like Lance, but I'm not sure that there's a fact about the answer to this because it's a semantic question. It's a semantic question about a technical term, which is moral realism, right? So we usually say, oh, well, it's independent of observers, but what if there's a person who thinks that they depends upon sort of like the ideal observer who's not a real observer, right? It depends upon what, like, the nature of rationality or something, and rationality is like a capacity of ours, but doesn't depend on any specific person or even all of the people who actually exist. So I don't know. There's not really a fact about whether that's realist or not. I guess I would think it's closer to realism. It sounds to me closer to traditional realist views than traditional anti-realist views. And I feel like the people who have that view would be happier. They'd be happier at a party of moral realists than at a party of anti-realists or something. So,
yeah. Cool. Next question's for Lance. Jack Kiesling 3294 asks, what do you think about the views in Bengtson, Cuneo, Schaefer-Landau, moral conceptual truths, or Bengtson and Schaefer-Landau of moral fixed points? It really he says that it really appeals to me as it enables me to say that there are no moral properties or facts out there in the world, appealing to Occam's razor and our scientific naturalistic worldview, while also saying that there are moral truths. They are conceptual truths, which appeals to my common sense, he says.
Well, I haven't read their new book, so I'd be hesitant to say anything especially substantive in response to that. But what I can say is that I have some vague awareness that there have been attempts to strip down the metaphysical aspects of what a moral realist is purportedly committed to, and just make these conceptual truths rather than, people don't want to be Platonists or something. I'm still going to have the same issue in those cases. I think, Parfit does this. I think Scanlon does this. I don't know their specific account, but my concerns with non-naturalist realism are not like I don't appeal to like Mackey's arguments where I would say, oh well, moral facts, whatever they would be weird metaphysically, and so I'm going to reject them. Now there's ways of fleshing that out where that sounds less superficial and silly. It's not like Mackey was just saying they seem funny and strange, so I don't like them. But he has other stuff to say. He makes an epistemic claims like if there were these facts, how would we even know about them? And maybe realists would just say we have answers to that. But those aren't my issues. My issues with non-naturalist realism is not about the metaphysics. It's actually about the conceptual issues. And so I don't think whatever's motivating them to strip out the metaphysics for me isn't going to be a problem for the reasons why I reject non-naturalist realism, which is a little weird because we didn't even actually discuss, I think, at all, and maybe that's a topic for another discussion. What I would say about these cases is that I think that they're going to fall into the same camp of being unintelligible in the sense that Bernard Williams suggested to Parfit, at least in that discussion that was described in On What Matters in the second volume. So I would say the same thing about these. On examining them, I'd probably think that they're employing these certain sorts of terms or concepts like something like an external reason, something like an irreducible normative fact. And I would have conceptual concerns with whether those are meaningful and whether they could be cashed out in a way that could be made sense of.
Sure. Mike, have you read Schiffer Landau's new book or article? I don't know which one.
No, sorry, no.
Okay, cool. So third question for Mike. Poggy Boggy again. A lot of anti-realists will grant that certain first-order normative moral judgments seem true, but claim not to have the intuition that they are true in a realist sense. For instance, they may grant it seems to be the case that torturing babies for fun is immoral, but not that the immorality is an objective property of the action. What would you say to such anti-realists? Do you think they are confused in some way? We did touch upon the topic in the debate, but yeah. Do you have any further points to add?
Yeah, so I feel like my opening statement sort of addresses that. Like, okay, so if you think that it's not an objective truth, then what do you think? Like it's an expression of emotion, or it's like, sort of like a disguised imperative or something. And okay, so that could be refuted by the Frege-Geach problem. Or, you think that you're actually just reporting on some people's attitudes, then I'm going to introduce a hypothetical scenario in which whatever person or group you think is relevant, they have different attitudes, right? And then I'm going to hope that you have the intuition that, that whatever the wrong thing is still wrong.
All right, cool. So next question for Lance. RK Desh Deepak, he seems to be an Indian. You seem to argue we can't assume most people are realist just based on regular normative dialogues. You also gave an analogy of multiple interpretations of quantum mechanics for this one. Does it applies to all kinds of realism, like external world realism or scientific truths? Do you think it's wrong for me to assume that most people, non-philosophers, I interact with are realists towards external world or realists towards scientific truths, just based on interactions?
It's a great question. I don't know the answer to that. So I take what non-philosophers in all of these cases are committed to be empirical questions. But I don't think every empirical question we need to conduct like surveys to find out. So, would most people not want to be dropped into a volcano? Yeah, I don't need to do a survey to find that out. Do most people think there's an external world in some sense that would crudely correspond to a wide range of philosophically defensible positions? I'm going to go with I think so. So I don't think most people could be are external world skeptics, nor do I think it would be. I don't think I would be like it's indeterminate whether people are external world skeptics or not. I think they're probably not. Depending on precisely how you construe that. There are some caveats, though. So, for instance, one thing worth pointing out is that there have been a few forays into finding out whether non-philosophers endorse the correspondence theory of truth. And that data is really like in one case, the authors throw it in a footnote and they're like, we couldn't get people to understand the questions we were asking them. There's a couple sort of published papers that look at this, and people give kind of mixed responses to this. So what do I make of that? I'm not sure. There's not a big enough literature there. So it's possible that people don't generally have a determinate position on the correspondence theory. And so then if you're saying, do people believe in an external world in the truth correspondence sense, then maybe the answer is no. But I wouldn't take that to mean, oh, well, then they must be skeptics, or they must be pragmatists, or they so they don't have to endorse any specific philosophical thesis for me to find it really implausible that they do or would come down on endorsing any particular position. But the problem is this would have to be handled piecemeal on a case-by-case basis. I'll give a case where I do think people just have determinate positions, and that's normative moral questions. I think it'd be really bizarre to say, I'm going to take no stance on whether people have attitudes or beliefs of some kind about what's morally right or wrong. That'd be silly. People clearly do. So I'm not so skeptical that I think everything is indeterminate. I think some things are indeterminate, some things probably aren't. Issues about consciousness, maybe that's indeterminate. Issues about free will, maybe that's indeterminate. But you have to handle these case by case.
Sure. Great. So next question for Mike, last question to you. Do you think subjectivism and other anti-realist views entail pernicious consequences?
Well, I think they could have bad consequences. I think, I was pausing over the word entail there, but they probably just meant, do they have bad consequences? Plausibly, right? So plausibly, it reduces our moral commitment. And now, this is related to the previous question about, is there like more force in your moral values if you think they're objective? Well, a lot of people seem to think so, right? And so, we'll probably be less committed to morality if we think that it's subjective, or there aren't any facts or something like that. Okay, I give away money to charity, but if I thought that the only reason for me to do that is to satisfy my own preferences, I think I would stop doing it. Because I'd be like, okay, I could satisfy some of my preferences by giving away money to charity, and then I introspect and I'm like, this isn't making me that happy. And I could spend more money on myself, take expensive vacations or something. Seems like that would satisfy more preferences anyway. But I don't think of it that way. I think of it as, well, it doesn't really matter if I prefer it. It's like the other people's suffering outweighs my own preferences. So, and I just suspect that there's a bunch of other people who would be like that.
Lance, do you have to say anything about that?
Well, I certainly don't think metaethical positions in and of themselves entail any negative consequences. I'm going to say the same thing I say about so many things. Whether or not in practice they would result in negative, like a belief in them would result in negative consequences, is an empirical question. It's going to be contingent, though, on facts about human psychology and how any given person or society happens to react to holding a particular philosophical position. And so it wouldn't necessarily be an indictment of the position. So, it could be that if you convinced people of subjectivism, they would become like radical egoists and run around stealing and doing terrible things. That would make subjectivism false. It would just mean, as a feature of the way human psychology is, people react badly to holding, and a potentially true belief. So it's just going to come down to an empirical question. I think in practice, the answer is that it will have very little effect on people's behavior. I don't think people are already realists, so I don't think that if you convince them of anti-realism, it would cause a radical change in their behavior from having been realist in the first place. So I don't think you're going to get that kind of effect. So there's at least that. As far, and another thing to say about this is I think this could work in reverse, where it could be that not as an entailment of a commitment to moral realism, but as some sort of contingent effect of its impact on human psychology, realism could have negative consequences. And again, that wouldn't make it wrong, but it could be that the adoption of realism makes people dogmatic, it makes them more rigid in their thinking, it makes them more disposed to attempt to justify their actions in a way that they override their own attitudes, feelings, or if a person's convinced that the objectively, stance independently right thing to do is to kill a group of people, even if they feel, I feel disgust. Well, it's, hey, look, I'm just following the orders of the transcendent moral truths. And so they get this, they could develop a kind of I'm just following orders mentality and do terrible things as a result of a commitment to moral realism. But again, not an indictment one way or the other of the position, because I don't think it's detailed by the position.
Okay, and talking about just following orders, there's a book that was released recently by a neuroscientist called Emily Kaspar. I'm having a conversation with her this Wednesday, so that's a coincidence. So she did some experiments on the brain science of following orders. So what is going on in the brains of people when they're following orders? Why is it so easy to follow orders, even if those have immoral consequences? So yeah, that's going to be an interesting conversation. So, and yeah, what else was there? So let me ask Lance your final question. Poggy Woggy asks, you've indicated skepticism about the existence of intuitions in the sense philosophers use it. But what else do you call our disposition to affirm certain propositions, like people's disposition to believe that they have hands and that 1 + 1 = 2, like that?
Yeah, it's a good question. I'm not going to have time because that's a whole discussion about metaphilosophy. So one thing to indicate is that if you look into how the term intuition is used among philosophers, it's not uniformly or consistently used to refer to dispositions for particular beliefs. If anyone is interested in looking into getting a quick overview of where talk of intuitions is at, you could look at the Stanford Encyclopedia entry of philosophy on intuitions, and you'll see that's one of the candidate characterizations that's been proposed for what intuitions are in the literature. But it's not the only one. There are these other ways that people have said, hey, actually, this is what intuitions are. Here's a better way to use intuitions. There's a variety of different characterizations of intuitions. And so if we're going to, if we take the term intuition and we ask, okay, well, how are philosophers using it? I think that's a tough philosophical question, and that to a certain extent, it's going to end up that philosophers are using it to refer to at least a few different things in different contexts, and it's going to be difficult to disentangle at least the several things that they're referring to. Some of those things may be genuine or real phenomena. If it's referring to a disposition to hold certain beliefs, well, certainly I think people have those. So then, sure, we have intuitions of that kind. But part of the question, it was interesting how it's framed. What would we call them if not that? We could call them. I don't want to be glib, but we could call them whatever we want. So at least one thing I would say about talk of intuition in philosophy is that, at least historically, it looks like the use of a specific term intuition has increased over the years. So in Capellan's book, Philosophy Without Intuitions, he talks about and proposes philosophers don't really use intuitions as, to resolve arguments or as evidence for claims. I'm not going to get into evaluating that particular claim because you have to get into precisely what he's saying there. But at the very least, it looks like its use has spiked in recent years. So what we would have to do in these cases is really just get philosophers to sit down and talk about what kinds of states that they're talking about. And what I suspect is that many of the ways in which we use the term intuition would be completely fine. So I think Timothy Williamson will just sometimes say intuitions are just continuous with our ordinary ways of thinking. That's a view of intuitions I could get on board with. But in some cases, philosophers may be appealing to certain types of mental states that we may not have. And so they might be saying, I have an intuition. And then if you actually examined the empirical literature, they're reporting a kind of pseudo-state, a pseudo-psychological state that they don't actually have. Very much, going back to my analogy to seeing auras, I think it's possible to convince people that they have certain kinds of faculties for detecting truth or seeing or quasi-perceptual capacities for knowing or thinking or perceiving certain sorts of facts that they may not actually have, and they may be misunderstanding their own phenomenology or mistaking inferences about the content of their phenomenology for substantive theoretical inferences about what's going on with their phenomenology. And in those cases, I think that those instances of intuition would be potentially misguided or mistaken. But you would have to first get clear on what people's commitment, what are they actually saying an intuition is, and then you would have to look at empirical data that we haven't really looked at. So I can't definitively say whether people do or don't have intuitions. What I would say is that I'm very skeptical of some uses of intuition among philosophers. Some of them seem to rely on presuppositions about human psychology or language or metaphysics that I don't endorse. And then in other instances, it looks like they're using them in totally innocuous ways I'm completely on board with. And it's just hard to parse the two, like which one is which.
Lance and his boring. It's an empirical question. So yeah, just kidding. Anyway, so that ends the questions for this debate. I would request you guys to start your closing statements if you have any. We can start with Lance, and then Mike can end.
Oh, I'm starting?
Yeah.
Cool. Okay. All right. So closing statements. I really enjoyed this discussion. What I would say is that I think the root of the problems between realists and anti-realists, like where that conflict should be resolved, is in the domain of deeper metaphilosophical questions about how we acquire knowledge, what intuitions are and how they work, what sort of epistemic status should they have. There's going to be deeper questions there that I don't think are typically addressed in most of the dispute between realists and anti-realists. I think from this discussion, my attitude about that hasn't changed. So I think Huemer's criticisms of the standard positions are largely directed at positions I don't endorse, and I reject all of those positions. And so I may reject them for different reasons than realists, but if we could rule those positions out, then I think that the real battle would be on a different battleground than typifies the disputes in contemporary analytic philosophy. So one thing I would say about this is that where I come down on these disputes is that I think realism, and to the extent that I reject realism, it's not like I reject it in the sort of concrete terms within the confines of the standard dialectic among contemporary analytic philosophers. I think that realism is a sort of symptom or byproduct of background metaphilosophical presuppositions that are themselves fundamentally misguided and wrong. I think those presuppositions are wrong, and that we're philosophers more broadly to reject those metaphilosophical presuppositions. It would just be to me an incidental and salutary byproduct of that they would not endorse moral realism. That might end up in practice resulting in them being some type of quietist about those particular philosophical disputes because there would be nothing motivating the dispute. So insofar as the dispute among realists and anti-realists turns on false presuppositions about how language and meaning work, well, if you don't endorse those views, then there's no dispute to have. So this for me is where I think the territory should go. Now, the issue with that is that very few people within the contemporary dispute are on my side on this matter. Like other anti-realists, I don't endorse the same views as they do. So this puts me in an awkward position because I'm not really part of that ongoing dialogue. I haven't published papers on my views on the matter. My views on the matter would typically be considered an extreme minority view. Nevertheless, I think that my views are very much in line with longstanding traditions within Western philosophy. Pragmatism, ordinary language philosophy. I'm not saying I'm endorsing some of these. I don't endorse ordinary language philosophy, but there's been this long sort of dissident strain within Western philosophy of positivism, logical positivism, pragmatism, ordinary language philosophy, and more recently experimental philosophy. And I'm very much on board with the undercurrents of the metaphilosophical approaches that those traditions are at least gesturing towards. And where I want to move discussions is more towards that and less towards these sort of skirmishes at the extremity of analytic philosophy. So I guess that's what I would say about that. The other thing I would just reaffirm is I still think that the problem of normative entanglement is highly operative in disputes between realists and anti-realists, and that it underwrites much of the presumptive, intuitive lack of appeal of anti-realist positions. When we're analyzing a lot of these cases, I actually think that realists in most instances, or in possibly every instance, actually totally underestimate the conceptual resources available to anti-realists, especially when those anti-realists are freed from the confines of being forced to comport themselves with one of those standard three positions, to address these cases and say, okay, I could look at the state of moral disagreements or how to assess the sentence in a way completely consistent with anti-realism, and that's not really a problem. The anti-realist doesn't come away with a totally counterintuitive position. And the last thing I would just say is one thing we didn't get into are the sort of positive arguments for moral realism. So there's like the argument for moral convergence. There's a variety of other arguments, companions and guilt sorts of arguments. I think anti-realists have pretty straightforward and, to me at least, very compelling and plausible responses to all of those. And this has led me to think that at least one of the reasons that anti-realists should hold their heads high and not be too concerned or compelled by realist arguments is that I don't think arguments for moral realism are strong, like any of them. I don't think I've ever seen a good argument for moral realism. I think there's, for instance, much stronger arguments for theism, even though I'm an atheist. And so uh, at least one of the things, and this is the last thing I'll say about this, is that I think realists for a long time have sort of operated under the presumption that there's some sort of they're in a sort of privileged position where their position is the more commonsensical position, that it's more of a default position. I know some philosophers called it more of a default position, and that the onus is on anti-realists to argue against that the burden is on anti-realists. And I don't accept that, and I think anti-realists should start rejecting that. I don't think that moral realism has shown itself to be in any sort of privileged default position that anti-realists need to overcome. I think anti-realists have no better or worse, like, I just don't think it's a default position. And so to the extent that we start this dialectic from the presumption that there's something to favor realism, I think that anti-realists should these days move towards denying that and then prompting realists to present arguments that don't rely on a presumption in favor of realism.
Sure. Thank you so much, Lance, for the closing statement. Before that, talking about positive arguments for moral realism, Mike didn't even touch the ontological argument for moral realism. Maybe we'll have time for that later someday. But yeah, I would invite Mike for your closing statement.
Okay, good. Thanks. Yeah, there are other realist arguments and responses to anti-realist arguments that we didn't get to, and which is surprising because it's like a 2-hour conversation, but there's still a lot of things we didn't talk about. I recommend that people look up my article on ontological proof of moral realism. That's entertaining. And there's also one, trying to remember the title of it, something like a liberal realist answer to debunking skeptics. Okay, but for other arguments, I guess I'll say some more about intuition, which came up near the end. Like, what is an intuition? What's an ethical intuition? According to me, intuitions are initial intellectual appearances. So an appearance is a kind of mental state in which something seems to you to be correct. And there are different kinds of seemings, different kinds of appearances, like there's sensory appearances, like it seems like there's a table in front of me, looks like there's a table in front of me. That's a species of seeming. And then there are memory appearances, like, I seem to remember having a sandwich yesterday or something. Okay. But then there's intellectual appearances, which are the ones that you have when you're just sort of like intellectually reflecting on something. Okay. And then there's the initial ones versus the inferential appearances. Inferential appearances are where something seems correct in the light of some other thing. Like you have some proposition that you believe, and then in the light of that, it seems to you like this other thing must be correct. Okay. But the initial intellectual appearances where you think about the thing and just by itself, it just seems like it has to be true. So, okay. And why should we care about our intuitions? My claim is that all beliefs that are reasonable candidates for being justified are based upon appearances. That is, when you're trying to figure out what's true, you form beliefs based on what seems true to you. And there are cases of maybe believing things that don't seem true to you, which are like self-deception. You have to sort of like try to talk yourself into believing the thing because it doesn't seem true, right? Or wishful thinking, but nobody thinks that those are justified beliefs. So my claim is that this is, appearances are the source of all rational beliefs. And okay, and if you don't accept a presumption in favor of believing that things are as they appear, then you're going to have no belief system. You're not going to be able to justify anything. Okay, that's my claim. But anyway, look at my other articles and my other books about this. My book, Skepticism and the Veil of Perception. Look at that one. Okay. Anyway, is there a presumption in favor of realism? I don't exactly think that there's a presumption for realism. I think there's a presumption that things are the way they appear. And then my claim is that if you start from the way things appear to most people, you can give arguments from those appearances to realism. So maybe we somewhat agree there. Anyway, then, what are the arguments for anti-realism? We didn't even really talk about those. Like the anti-realists, like they commonly say, moral facts would be weird. The so-called argument from queerness. Okay, and that's not all they say. Like they say some things that would be weird about them, right? Right, but it's very common for people to have something like that. It's weird. It's queer. It doesn't fit into the scientific worldview. Okay, and then another thing they commonly say is, "Oh, there's just so much disagreement about morality." I think those have been traditionally the most famous arguments. They're like, and now more recently, it's more popular to talk about evolution and to say, "Oh, well, our capacity to make moral judgments evolved by natural selection," which means that it's probably just an adaptation to help us survive and reproduce. Which means that even if there are objective moral facts, there's no reason why our cognitive capacities would have been lined up to identify the objective truths. Okay, so then that's supposed to get you, skepticism. So, and now, like I can't respond to all of these, but I think these are all bad arguments, and I think they're all terrible arguments. There aren't any good arguments for anti-realism. But there's a bunch of anti-realists who just have like anti-realist intuitions. I think that's really the situation.
Sure. Thank you so much, Mike, for the closing statement. I would like you to tell us where to find you, where to read your books, and yeah.
I have a blog on Substack called Fake News, which is spelled FAKENOUS. Right, similar to fake news, but it's with news. Okay, so look at my blog. And also, look me up on Amazon because I have some books that everybody should buy.
Sure. And Lance, where can people find you?
They could find me on YouTube and on Substack under the name Lance Independent. It's a play on the term stance independent. And if they want, they could read some of my articles. I'm not as prolific as Huemer. I haven't published any books or anything, but I've got a few articles. And a lot of the stuff that I've said here, you could find aspects of that, across various blog posts on my blog, Lance.
You should release some books soon, Lance.
Yeah, it's good. If you self-publish books, then you get more money from than the traditional publishers. So, I recommend it.
Nice new background, Lance, in New York. Better than the previous one, I think.
A little better. I still need a better background than this one.
Yeah. Anyway, so it was an amazing conversation. I just can't believe that this debate has ended. And I don't want it to end. I can listen to you forever. And like they said,
say it on a loop, all day, and then.
Yeah. No, there's a lot more to discuss, right? Not just this. Like we mentioned, like you mentioned, there's a lot more arguments to discuss. But anyway, that's all the time we have for today. I hope you had a fun time listening to this debate. And tell me in the comments below whose views are more persuasive to you, more compelling to you, and who do you think won the debate or anything. Yeah, hit the comment section up with all those comments and whatever you have to say about realism, moral anti-realism. And did you like the conversation, and would you like to have more such debates and conversations on the channel? Tell me in the comments below. Also, I've had conversations with Lance a couple of 3 times, in fact. You can see that in the YouTube channel. Also, I've had a conversation with Mike recently that you can see in the YouTube channel. Please check them out. You could get answers to a lot more questions that you might not have gotten answers to this time around. Yeah, so that's the end of that, I guess. Thank you so much, you curious people, for listening into the debate. I'm sure you had fun. And for all the new listeners to the channel, please subscribe to the channel for more such videos. So yeah, that ends the day today. Thank you so much for coming in. And yeah, let me thank Lance Bush and Mike Huemer once again for coming on to the show. It's a privilege and honor, like I always say, that I'm able to have these conversations with you, and that I'm hosting you guys debate on the channel. It's a real privilege. Thank you so much for coming again. For more such conversations ahead, there's going to be more on free will. I'm going to be having a conversation with Mike, hopefully, in the future on free will. And there's one more conversation with Lance that's coming up. So please Stay tuned and stay curious. Thank you so much.